Hi everybody, my name is Hannah and this is Pepper and Pine, and I have a super simple knitting tutorial to share with you today based on this book called Teaching Through Stories by Elizabeth Seward. This book is a rich resource for any teacher or home educator. It is packed with stories that you can use with knitting, as well as some super simple tutorials. Today we're going to make the pocket dolly. Here are some examples that my children and I have made. This one my daughter made when she was quite young. It's a little bit different than the one I'm going to show you today, but it is an alternative option if you want to make it with a hard base that can stand upright. This is the one that you'll find in the book. It comes with a little hat and it's a two-piece project. Today we're going to work on this one, which is a single piece project. I find it a little bit simpler and I do like the way this one looks. You also need some jersey knit for the head. And I'm using my Lamb's Pride bulky yarn. You can use any color you'd like. You need about 1 ounce of yarn. You will need some thread in order to sew the head, and of course some knitting needles. So the first thing we're going to do is take some yarn, about enough to do 20 cast on stitches, and for this I measure from the tip of my finger up to my shoulder. You want to be generous with this part. It's okay if you have too much, but if you have too little, you will have to start again. So at this point, I want to do a slip knot. I'm going to twist my yarn and then grab it and pull it through. Super simple. And this is going to be the first stitch that you're going to put on your knitting needle. So I'm going to slip my knitting needle right through, and then I want to adjust it. You want it to be snug, but definitely not too tight and not too loose. So we're going to begin by casting on our 20 stitches. So I'm slipping my fingers through the yarn and then pulling it down into a V. And then I'm going to take my needle, and I want my needle sort of close to the top, and I'm going to swing from one side to the other, grabbing the yarn as I go, slipping it right through the yarn from the start. So we're going to do this again a few times until we can be really comfortable doing this form of casting on. So once again, we're going to grab the yarn near our thumb, swing it around and get the yarn on our index finger and come right through in between those two pieces of yarn. Use our thumb to make it snug in place on our knitting needle, and we're going to do this again. There are several ways that you can cast on. There are several ways to knit, and there are several ways to cast off or bind off. So I'm teaching you this method, which you could do a number of methods when it comes to teaching your students, but there is one method with knitting that I would recommend over other methods. So as I'm going, I'm realizing that my stitches are a little bit on the tight side. I tend to be a tight knitter, which will make it harder to knit, hurt your fingers more. And if you knit too loose, you can end up with a patchy project. How you cast on will determine how easy it is to do your first row of knitting. If you cast on too tightly, you'll realize the second you start knitting that you're having a tough time getting your knitting needles through your yarn. So if you get to the end of casting on and you realize that it's too tight, you can either cast on again, or by the time you're done doing one row of knitting more loosely, then you'll have an easier time. And if you cast on too loosely, you will also have a difficult time knitting. You might miss a stitch or end up with patchy project in the end. So we want to get to a point where our casting on and our knitting stitches are just so. Once we have our 20 stitches, we want to take that tail and tie a little knot around it as a reminder that we don't want to knit that tail. That tail is quite short, so it's not likely that I will make the mistake of thinking I should knit that. However, if your tail is longer, then I highly recommend that you tie it up in some way. You can leave it for now. You may need it when we're sewing up our project in the end, but you just want to make sure that you're not going to accidentally knit it. So there are two ways to knit. There's the English way and the continental way. With the continental way, you will have the yarn on your left finger, and the English way is to have the yarn on your right finger or dominant hand. So now we're going to start by knitting with the English way so that the yarn is in our right hand, which means that you will be doing cross body action as you're knitting, and this is something that we want when we are teaching young children. So I'm showing here what not to do. Don't poke your yarn. This is bulky weight yarn, so it's very easy to end up slicing your yarn as you're knitting. So you want to take care to make sure that you are not doing that. And when your stitches are too loose or too tight, you're likely to make those kinds of mistakes. So you want to make sure that your stitches are nice and even and just in between too tight and too loose. Okay, let's get that tail out of the way. Want to make sure that we're not knitting it. We just don't want it in our way. So we're going to take our needle and put it right through that stitch. So you have a cross with your knitting needles, wrap your yarn around it, and then bring it right through, and then you can pop that stitch off. We're going to do this again a few times. As you go, you want to tighten your yarn, but not too tight. Since I tend to knit on the tighter side, I need to remember to loosen my stitches as I go. And if you are someone who knits really loosely, then you want to be more mindful of tightening your stitches as you go. And once again, I'm showing you what not to do. As you bring your yarn around your knitting needle, you want to make sure that you bring it all the way around and that you're not slicing through your yarn with your knitting needle. Now, I did make these knitting needles from scratch using dowels, and what I like about making my own knitting needles is that for a beginner project like this, I prefer my knitting needles to be a bit more blunt and not as pointy as typical needles, and this is just for the beginner projects for grade 1. I prefer that. I find that it's a little bit easier for our first projects to do that. So I'm going to continue knitting through, making sure that I have 20 stitches in the end, that I didn't drop or pick up any stitches along the way. So once I pop that last stitch off, I can count them up again to make sure. Then I'm going to put that in my left hand so that I can continue knitting. So I'm just counting by twos just to ensure I've got 20. I do, so we're good to go. So now I'm going to continue knitting on the other side. Now, after you've done 2 rows, you will see that you've created 1 ridge of knitting. And so you want to be able to count your ridges so that you have 20 ridges, which is 40 rows. And counting ridges is a little bit easier. And you can see at this point, I almost have 20 ridges, but you can just count each ridge as you go. And at this point, we want about 5.5 inches by 6 inches. This is such a forgiving project. You can do a 5-inch square, you can do a 6-inch square, you could do a rectangle that's almost about 5.5 to 6 inches. I'm using an existing doll just to see if this is about the size that I want it. You can make these a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, and you can get creative and use multiple colors of yarn if you'd like as well. So I'm thinking that I want 1 more row and then my cast off row, so a total of 1 more ridge in essence. So I'm going to quickly knit this last row before I show you how to bind off. So we used about an ounce of yarn, and we can get about 4 of these dolls for 1 skein of yarn. So we're going to knit 2 stitches. And here's the fun part. We're going to take that first stitch and pop it over our second stitch. And we're going to keep doing that. Now you have to pay attention because you might just get back into the flow of knitting. You'll have to undo those stitches if you get back into knitting when you are actually binding off. So here's the fun part. We're down to our last 2 stitches, and now we just have the 1. So we're going to measure out some yarn because we're going to be using that excess yarn on the tail in order to sew up our pocket dolly. So I'm just trying to estimate about how much I need. And if you measure from the tip of your finger to your shoulder and then back halfway again, it's probably going to be about enough. So I'm going to take that tail, slip it through that last stitch, and that's going to keep the stitch in place. I'm just going to make it nice and snug, but not too tight. And then at that point, I have some yarn that I can use for sewing. So I have this needle, which is specifically for sewing on knitted projects. And I'm going to take just the outer stitch, and it's pretty obvious to see, but then again, this is a very forgiving project. Even if you go 1 row in, it's totally okay. And you can either stitch this and leave it the way it is, or stitch it and turn it inside out. Both are going to be fine because you're not going to be able to see very much once you are done sewing what's the outside and what's the inside. So I'm going to start at the bottom here, and I'm just going to go back and forth until it's closed up, and then I'm going to go back again so that my yarn is back where I started so that I can start to sew up the front side of my little dolly. And again, I'm just catching those outside stitches from my casting on and binding off, and that way I can sew up the side. And once I get to about 2/3 of the way up, I'm going to do a couple extra stitches right in this spot because this is where the little head is going to go. And you can eyeball about how far up you want to go. About 2/3 of the way seems to work pretty well. And I've gone a couple of stitches here just to keep it in place. And at this point, you can leave it as is, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it inside out. And then we're going to stuff it before we continue sewing it up. So we can leave our needle with the yarn on it. And once we fill it up, then we can sew it again. So I have some wool batting here. Just about anything will do. You do not need to use your fancy stuff. You can use what you have on hand. I have a box of extra yarn bits. We could use that as well. But as you fill this little pocket dolly, the yarn itself will get stretched out a little bit. So it's best if you are going to use other filler to at least wrap it with some of your wool batting. So that's what shows through, that peeks through your stitches. So that seems about good for now, but I actually fill it a little bit more later. But now we're going to work on the head, and I have a number of colors that you can use for the skin tones. I'm going to use the darker version of the colors that I have. I think it's going to look stunning with the yellow. And I'm measuring about 5 inches on both sides and then just trimming that off. So it's about a 5-inch square, and using a little bit more of that wool batting to fill our head. And I'm going to bring up all 4 corners. That looks about right, but I'm actually going to add a little bit more filler after I sew the edges together. And I'm sewing it corner to corner, but you could just sew it all the way around, probably be a little bit easier. At this point, I realize it needs some more filler. And now that I've sewn it in place a little bit, it's a little bit easier to fill it up. And then I can go back to sewing it around and making sure that it's nice and snug. I don't want it to come out. I don't want it to peek out either. And I want it to be nice and secure. So I'm going to tie it off. And then I've put it into my little pocket dolly to see if the head size is good and just fussing around with it a little bit till it's just the way that I want, tucking in that other tail so that it's inside the pocket dolly and not hanging out. And now I'm going to sew up the top. And I'm sewing a little bit extra right on the tip so that it almost looks like a little bit of a pointy hat, just a touch on the very tip part. And then again, going through the top stitches. At this point, you want to be maybe a little bit more careful since you're not turning your dolly inside out at this point. And then I'm going to estimate about how much face I want to have showing. And this one has a bit more than the previous pocket dolly that I made. And I kind of like the way this one turns out a little bit more. And then I'm taking that extra yarn and going around the neck by catching all of those top stitches and wrapping my yarn around just so that it can be a little bit tighter around the neck and give a little bit more definition between the head and the body. And luckily I have just enough yarn to finish this off so I don't have to add any more yarn. And I did not go exactly all the way around, so I'm going to try to correct that right at the end so it's a little bit more even. And then once I get it to the way that I want and I fuss around with it a little bit, then I can tie that off by pulling it a little bit and then catching another stitch and then pulling it through. I think I have room for about one knot only. Make it nice and snug, and here's the magic. Stick it right back into your pocket dolly. Go several rows or stitches down, pull it out. And then at this point, you want to pull a little bit snugly, trim it off, and then your yarn is hidden inside your pocket dolly, and you won't see any of your extra stitches. It's so cute in the end. It is adorable. It makes such a cute little play toy or a gift. It is a super easy project to do with your children. It is a great grade 1 or grade 2 project for about a 7-year-old or 8-year-old. I highly encourage you to give it a try. I hope that you enjoyed this super simple tutorial on how to make a pocket dolly. Don't forget to check out Elizabeth's book. It is a gem. You can find the link to that book as well as other tutorials on the blog post that accompanies this video. You can find the link to that blog post in the description box below. And if you'd like to see what kind of projects we're doing on a daily basis, you can find me on Instagram and now on TikTok at Pepper and Pine.